Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine radicalism in Scotland, past and present. The Christmas election drew into stark relief the divergence of the politics of Scotland and England, the two original partners in the creation of the United Kingdom in 1707. While England decided on a pro-Brexit and pro-Tory direction, Scotland confirmed that it was anti-Brexit and anti-Tory. Today we examine the radical politics of Scotland past and present with author and MP Kenny MacAskill and political columnist George Kerevan. But first, your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show on child refugees and some quite conflicting opinions. Kevin says, better get to building more affordable accommodations then. Should also deal with the rampant rise in homelessness here too while you're at it, before we go opening the door to yet more people we won't be able to look after. Glenys says, the Tories are playing to the far right. They've lit the touch paper and are standing back, watching and listening to people who have the same views as them, but will let them chant and preach it. They don't want to lose their well-paid jobs now, do they? David says, the same Westminster government that is trying to throw as many foreign people out of the UK as possible. I'm not in the least surprised that they don't want to help. Robert says, that dead child on the beach was just so heartbreaking. God love him. Jemima says, we have enough children needing help here. Charity begins at home. William says, what about our own kids? Should we not get our own house in order first? And finally, Wilma says, shame on the British government. Now, former Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill MP has built up a formidable reputation as an author before entering the Westminster Parliament in the December election.
The Earl of Liverpool is the third longest serving Prime Minister. But in the town of Tranent in 1797, he's better recalled because he was a British military commander when the massacre of Tranent took place. 12 men, women and children were slain because they opposed the imposition of conscription. The Prime Minister, or the Earl of Liverpool, was then the military commander for East Central Scotland. He wasn't responsible for the order to fire, but he was culpable and indeed took the blame according to the Lord Advocate. But he obviously went on to greater things and he became the Prime Minister in 1820. And
Alex speaks to him about his newly released volume on Scotland's radical history. This deals with the period from the French Revolution to the radical rising of 1820.
Kenny MacAskill, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show. Now, Kenny, there are some advantages to all this book writing. I mean, they help you with material, as we've just seen, for your first speeches in the House of Commons. What was the massacre of Tranent in your constituency?
It was a military atrocity that became a state cover-up. It was anti-militia riots that took place all over Scotland in 1797 as people objected to conscription being brought in, as the army required soldiers for the Napoleonic Wars, and they also required soldiers for, as they put it, internal tranquility, which was a euphemism for repressing the people who had been inspired by the French Revolution. Some 12 people were killed as the army frankly ran amok in my small constituency, and the link that I was happy to point out in my maiden speech was that the military commander in 1797 was the Earl of Liverpool, who became the Prime Minister, and ironically, as I conclude my book, was Prime Minister at the time of the 1820 Rising, who oversaw the hanging and then the beheading of Baird, Hardy and Wilson, our Scottish martyrs, or some of our Scottish martyrs.
Of course, Lord Liverpool was also the target of the Cattle Street conspiracy at that time. But, you know, most members of Parliament making the first speech in the House of Commons, you know, they talk about the dreamy spires, the lovely countryside, the doughty people of their constituency. There are not many people that refer to repression and massacres.
Well, part of this is trying to record the radical memory, and this is what perhaps inspired me for the book, because it became quite clear that after the 1820 Rising there was a concerted effort by the establishment to record history as they saw it. Because after all history is recorded to some extent by the victors. In Scotland it hasn't been a foreign invading army, it's been our lords and ladies. And the radicals saw streets going down to the Hanovers, to Frederick, to Princes Street or whatever. They saw statues to Wellington, to Nelson and to others, the lords and ladies, the despot Henry Dundas. And they said, where's our memory?
There's some advantages also to having an interregnum between your period as a Justice Secretary in Scotland and a member of the Scottish Parliament and newly elected as a member of the Westminster Parliament. You've now written 7 books. all of which have a constant theme on Scotland's radical history, your biography of Jimmy Reid, and now this latest book, Scotland's Radical History Between the Napoleonic Wars and the 1820 Rising, which you've just referred to. Why did you choose that period for your latest book?
Glasgow 1919 book was inspired partly by those who'd inspired Jimmy Reid in the rise of Red Clydeside, but doing that research it became quite clear that Scotland's radical roots went far beyond that. They went back...
You're working your way back.
Went back to 1790s and to Thomas Muir, and it became quite clear that Thomas Muir inspired those who fought in Rose in 1820.
Thomas Muir was the radical of the early 1790s, who famously was transported to Australia, became the world's most wanted man as he was hunted round the globe by the British, ended up in revolutionary France, was plotting an invasion of Scotland, another radical rising when unfortunately he died, but a very glamorous, heroic figure. And of course, as you point out, when people arrive at Waverley Station in Edinburgh, there's a monument you can't miss in Carlton Cemetery. That is to Thomas Muir, is it not? That's
to Thomas Muir and his other Scottish martyrs. Ironically, 3 of the 5 of whom were English. I think a lot of people in Scotland don't realise that, how we fought together, albeit distinctively in Scotland. But Thomas Muir's obelisk, and I think that shows part of the reason why I've written this book, because I read an article from an Australian academic that had pointed out the difficulties in even putting that memorial up. Because after 1820, when all these statues to lords and ladies and the greater good of the burgeoning British Empire were going up, there was a desire to record the radical past that was being written out. So they decided to try and put the obelisk on top of Carlton Hill in Edinburgh that would have been visible to all and sundry, and the Tory council objected. They bought land at Carlton Cemetery, and some of the Tories litigated because they thought this would disturb the peace of the dead, including obviously Hume's mausoleum that's within the same cemetery. But they overcome that, and that's why it was unveiled in the early 1840s, to show that there was a different history to the statues to the lords and ladies.
But isn't that cemetery itself an indication that there are 2 Scotlands? Because not within yards of the obelisk to Muir and the other friends of the people, there is David Hume's mausoleum, as you rightly say. But you would hardly describe David Hume, one of the fathers of the Enlightenment, as a radical in the sense that he wanted to see uprisings against the established authority.
Well, I don't think it's either or. I think it's both. I think it's right that we should have statues as well as a mausoleum to David Hume. But I also think we should record the radical history and the radical memory. And sadly, Scottish history has tended to focus upon some of the romantic aspects of Bonnie Prince Charlie or Mary Queen of Scots. And it's not focused on those that were driving forward the history of a better Scotland, because after the 1820, those who weren't executed but who'd been transported came back. They were revered and feted by the Chartists. Keir Hardie and the fledgling Labour movement marched to banners that included the same banners that had been used in the 1820 rising of Scotland Free or a Desert. That followed on to the Red Clydesiders. That's why, as I was saying earlier, the radical roots of Scotland don't just go back through Jimmy Reid to Red Clydeside. They go back to Thomas Muir and to that time when the French Revolution ignited the working people of Scotland, who saw for the first time that there was another way, that it wasn't just a promised land in heaven, that there could be a different way here on earth.
How do you reconcile the figures of the Enlightenment, many of whom, like Adam Smith or David Hume, came from humble upbringing, but had the patronage of the establishment of the lords and ladies, often their tutors, as it happened, and the working class radical, the skilled tradesmen who were the kernel, often supported, of course, by radical lawyers like yourself. Where does that Enlightenment Scotland fit in? The great figures, many of whom came from very humble origins.
Oh, they did, and they continued to come through even through the British Empire. People who went abroad and did great works came from very humble backgrounds. But I think what we saw as we moved out of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, we saw the beginnings of the rise of the industrial age, and that's why manufacturing processes were coming in more perhaps in England and Manchester and London than in Scotland. But the weaving industry was taking off and it was changing. And long before the miners became the backbone of the Scottish Labour movement, it was the weavers. They were artisans. They didn't consider themselves as perhaps as working men, but they were educated, they were literate. These were people who saw that the French Revolution offered a different way. So they were the working class made good. They didn't have the patronage of the lords and ladies, and indeed they wanted to challenge them. So I think their history runs in parallel. The problem in Scotland is we've tended to ignore them and concentrate on the lords and ladies.
But the very few people now, I would think, would regard Henry Dundas, the towering figure of the Prime Ministership of Pitt the Younger, ran Scotland for Pitt the Younger, was the last Westminster politician to be impeached, incidentally, for malfeasance in the Royal Navy he was accused of. But very few people would regard their history as the be-all and end-all now. But a lot of people would argue that in terms of impact on humanity, the Enlightenment figures have had more impact than the working class figures like Muir or Baird and Hardy of 1820. Has their legacy really had that sort of impact that you could claim for Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations or the moral philosophy of David Hume?
Oh, I think recording the Enlightenment is necessary and vital. I don't necessarily think I put Henry Dundas or King Harry. He was a despotic figure, and indeed I think his contribution to the British Empire was shameful in many ways, given that he postponed action being taken against slavery. He basically ran Scotland as a despot. He was in control of something like 41 out of 43 Tory MPs at one stage in Scotland. He ran it as an oligarchy on behalf of rich landlords. Sometimes I look at the names of the rich landlords that he represented, and I look at the House of Lords and the ownership of land in Scotland, and I wonder what's changed after all these years. So I think I put Dundas in a different category than I would, for example, Adam Smith or David Hume. And it's the people that challenged Dundas that need to be recorded. That's why the bicentenary of the 1820 Rising, when the Henry Dundases were taken on, is so important, because Dundas and his nephew, the Lord Advocate, also had Dundas, Robert Dundas, were shameful. Going back to the massacre at Tranent, you read the state archives. They knew it was a military atrocity. They covered it up. The only person to be prosecuted was, in fact, a magazine that ran a letter from one of the victims' widows or widower, who told what had happened, and they were sued for defamation by one of the military officers involved. So they knew what had happened, they covered it up, and that was why they were building garrisons all across central Scotland, because they knew that the people of Scotland didn't, as we now see in terms of Hornblower and Chart, view France as the enemy. They, in 1794, as with Thomas Muir, saw France as the opportunity for working people, ordinary people, to control their own lives and destiny.
But wouldn't it be the case that people like, the 1820 martyrs, they were appealing to working class people across Britain, as they put it in their proclamations? Isn't it a case that they were actually looking, perhaps as the Labour Party has done, looking for change across these islands, as opposed to seeing Scotland as a distinct entity?
I think it's both. I mean, Scotland was a distinct entity. Scotland was a different country, different laws, different church. Even the language was significantly different, even though they all spoke English. And they lived in their own world because transport and mass media hadn't come along. That said, what they were fighting for was a universal franchise, which was based at Westminster, because let's remember that the franchise in the 1790s in Scotland was available to 4,000 people. It was reckoned that half of them were fictitious, and this was a country that had a population approaching 2 million. This wasn't a democracy, it was an oligarchy of landlords.
You've got a grand story about an election in the island of Bute.
Fantastic story of the constituency then, as you'll know the geography of Scotland, Bute, Ross and Cromarty, which extended down the east coast of Scotland, where there was an election, and the election was to take place in Rothesay in the Isle of Bute. Because of bad weather, there was only one candidate on the island, and he turned out not only to be the only candidate, but the only voter. And without any sense of shame or irony, he nominated himself. He then seconded himself in a different capacity, being a local worthy. He voted for himself. He then had himself declared the winner by the sheriff, and off he went to Westminster. That was democracy in the 1790s. I think probably what we'll see today is his scions and his ilk are probably sitting in the House of Lords.
Kenny MacAskill, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Scotland's radical history could fill many volumes, and by the sound of it, Kenny MacAskill may yet contribute a few more. Join us after the break, where we bring the story of politics of radical Scotland bang up to date. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Author and MP Kenny MacAskill has released a book on Scotland's radical political history. But who are the radicals now in Scottish politics, and are they winning or losing? Alex turns to someone who is both a Labour councillor and then an SNP MP, economist and columnist George Kerevan.
George Kerevan, former Labour councillor, former Scottish National Party MP, associated with a number of left of centre, left-wing groups through the last generation in Scottish politics. What do you think of this Kenny MacAskill thesis of this radical thread running through Scottish politics over the last couple of centuries?
Hello, Alex, and thanks for having me back. And yes, you remind me, you and I have been through a few organisations together on the radical left. Kenny MacAskill is doing us a great service. I don't know where he finds the time, but he's churning out these books. And what he's doing, he's recovered a whole red line of history, radical history in Scotland, going way back several hundred years. A line that is right down to the present day. Indeed, Kenny's just been elected to Westminster from radical East Lothian, and hopefully he still finds the time to go on writing.
So this argument that at various times through the last couple of hundred years that radical forces have coalesced behind either a movement like the Friends of the People, the 1820 Rising, or a political party in the 20th century like the Independent Labour Party and now the SNP. How credible is that as an argument? I
think, there's a kind of religious tradition. Scotland began socially, and in religious communities where people met every week and they discussed the Bible and they discussed the Old Testament, where the kings of Israel were held to account if they didn't do right by the people. And by morality. And I think that tradition is deeply imbued in Scottish history. And even in modern days, look at modern days, the revival of nationalism in Scotland and a radical left in Scotland actually began in the 1960s. It began with the folk music movement and people marching against nuclear missiles in the Clyde and recovering their old folk songs and putting new lyrics onto them. And that then morphed into opposition to the then Harold Wilson Labour government, and that led to the occupation to Upper Clyde shipbuilders in opposition in the 1970s to the return of mass unemployment. All of this traditionally was from below, and it's quite often the case it's the politicians who have to react to the people rather than the other way around.
And have these movements and parties been at their most powerful when they've managed to unite the Labour movement with the national question? Has that been the secret of, at various times, different parties, different forces coming to preeminence in Scottish politics?
We just had a general election, and in Scotland, the left parties gained something like 2/3 of the popular vote. In the rest of Europe, the left-wing parties collectively in any election are lucky if they get up to 45%. So there's a deep movement, and what's I think puts Scotland ahead of the game in the rest of Europe is the combination of a revulsion at austerity combined with a desire for independence, for Scotland to take back its ancient right of self-determination. So you're absolutely right. When the two come together, when the Scots decide not only that they're morally outraged, but they want to do something about it by taking back control, to coin a phrase, and run their own affairs, then politics becomes potent north of the border.
But what about the other Scotland? I mean, in the times that Kenny MacAskill's writing about, the Napoleonic period, the time of Robert Burns, of course, as the great radical people's poet, or the 1820 Rising, there's another Scotland. There's a Scotland who are firmly attached to the state of the United Kingdom, who are firmly in charge, it has to be said, of Scotland. And even in present times, the second party of Scotland is no longer the Labour Party, but the Conservative Party, with almost a quarter of the vote. Now, is there another Scotland who are actually quite content with the state of the United Kingdom and its nature of its politics, even with Brexit and many examples? How does the radical forces or the national movement reach out to that Scotland? Are they beyond the pale?
Well, I mean, the great radical poet Hugh MacDiarmid, who also one of the founders of the SNP, I mean, he used to write about these two halves of the Scottish psyche. That we are radicals on the one hand when we act collectively out of some moral outrage, but as individuals we can be quite dour and conservative. And when we don't see a way forward, we tend to get very, very kind of inward looking, and that leads to conservative politics. I think some of it also goes back to the fact that when the Act of Union happened, 1707, when Scotland joined in with the rest of the UK rather against its will, part of the deal was that much of Scotland was left in the hands of a very narrow conservative establishment. And whenever they get in control, they tend to support the status quo. So look back to as recently as 1955 general election. A majority of Scots voted Tory, which you would think unusual from today's perspective. But that usually reflects a period of quiescence when individual Scots are demoralised and don't know where to go politically. And then suddenly they wake up and they get angry. So there are these two souls, but what always dominates in the end is this radical sense of fairness and justice, social justice, and that always triumphs, I think, in the end.
And how content are the variety of strands of radical politics in Scotland with the electoral preeminence of the SNP? Are they quite happy with that, or are some people looking for stronger policies in terms of a radical position?
There's a mood of frustration. And I mean, I've heard lots of people talk about, looking back to the 1920s, where after the Red Clydeside, which Kenny MacAskill wrote about very, very eloquently, the Independent Labour Party, the ILP MPs, elected on the back of the great movement on Red Clydeside after the First World War. I mean, when they went down to Westminster, I mean, they just didn't reduce themselves to making speeches. They made a nuisance of themselves. They were outraged. They were stuck in a chamber that was unwilling to do anything about mass unemployment and mass hunger. And so there's a feeling up here that now, today in Scotland, that maybe the kind of anger that the Red Clydesiders showed, we need that anger back again in the chambers, both at Holyrood and at Westminster. And
how about the green politics and feminism? I mean, are these forces part of this great radical coalition? And if they are, can that great radical coalition hold together?
I think the coalition, it has to hang together, otherwise it hangs separately, to remember an old phrase. There are new forces in play, and I was at a mass assembly the other week called by an organisation called All Under One Banner, which is the organisation that's been organising the mass demonstrations that we've seen in Scotland over the last 18 months, the biggest demonstrations that I have seen in my lifetime, calling for independence. And at this assembly, which had delegates from all across Scotland, there was a lot of talk about how we need to bring together the movement against climate change with the movement for independence, because we've only got one nation and we've only got one earth, and the only people who are going to look after Scotland's environment are the Scots themselves, and for that they need to have independence. So there's a very clear understanding in the movement that it has to act together. Indeed, there's lots of discussion going on at the moment that maybe the time has come for the different organisations in the movement, All Under One Banner, Commonweal, the Independence Foundation, all the local yes groups, which are now very prominent. There's a hunger and feeling that they need to come together in some way and organise themselves separately from the elected politicians in the various chambers, that we need to move beyond talk to action.
Well, you make the point about these great, huge demonstrations taking place in Scotland, but often they seem to be taking place not with the sanction of the SNP leadership, but many in the SNP leadership, or some at least, have been a bit leery of these demonstrations, not quite sure if it's the right thing to do. It's an extraordinary example of a grassroots movement uprising, as it were, without the being organised by an official leadership. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing in the sense that nobody is sitting in front of the telly waiting for some elected member, some elected politician to tell them what to do. The ordinary working class Scots are getting out there, not just once a year, but they're getting out there month after month after month, demonstrating. Last year we had a whole bunch of demonstrations, including 200,000 people marching, flags waving through Edinburgh. The next big demonstration is in April. in Arbroath, commemorating the Declaration of Arbroath, which is really the kind of written foundation of Scotland's demand for nationhood.
Well, on that basis, the April the 6th Declaration of 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath, some people argue it was the first enunciation of the concept of popular sovereignty, of Scottish nationhood, but the right of the community of the realm to take action. Are you positive, are you confident that the community of the realm of Scotland is going to find its way forward?
Well, to go back to that very incident of going back to 1320, I mean the Declaration of Arbroath is of course written by the barons, by the Norman barons, but that whole initial Scottish independence movement was a veritable peasant uprising. It was plebeian. It was from below. It was just that the big barons took advantage of it. So the Scots, right back till then, have been a people who asserted from below their right to be a nation. And we're still fighting, and I think we'll go on fighting until that nationhood is re-established, hopefully soon.
But my old tutor, Professor Geoffrey Barrow, told me once a long time ago that the key phrase in the Declaration is the community of the realm. So I'll put to you again, George Kerevan. Is the community of the realm of Scotland, you think it's in fine fettle to progress its case?
You know, we're off our knees and we're fighting, yes. Hope to see everyone watching at Arbroath.
Thank you very much, George.
When one thinks of the history of radical Scotland, one thinks of the Braveheart tales of Bruce and Wallace down to the Red Clydesiders of the 1920s and 30s. Kenny MacAskill argues that there is a thread running through Scottish history, and the history of radicalism and Scottish nationalism are deeply intertwined. From the Friends of the People to the early Labour movement in Scotland, all had Home Rule at the top of their masthead. Now Scotland's modern swing to radicalism faces the equally triumphant English populism of Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers. However, with the SNP now electorally dominant over the country, are today's radical forces fully comfortable under that independence banner? Or are they restless for a more radical approach? And what of the other Scotland, the one which is douce and conservative? Could some of their still substantial numbers accept Scottish independence, but fear politics of the left? In the ability to reconcile these forces lies the future of the nation. Next week, we tell the story of a remarkable journalist who shot to fame 20 years ago when she was captured by the Taliban. Alex speaks to Yvonne Ridley and finds out what she's doing now. But for now, from Alex, myself and all of the show, it's goodbye, and we hope to see you then.